Hello, good afternoon. This is Alan Elsner, Vice President of Communication for J Street, welcoming you to this discussion with Guy Ziv. And the topic today will be the state of the coalition negotiations in Israel. Let me just briefly introduce our guest. Dr. Guy Ziv is an assistant professor in the School of International Service and a U.S. foreign policy program at American University. Teaches a variety of undergraduate and graduate courses on U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East and international negotiations. His current research focuses on foreign policy decision-making, the influence of think tanks in U.S. foreign policy, and the role of political elites in the Arab-Israeli conflict. He's written works on the impact of Israel's nuclear policy on U.S.-Israel relations, Israel's strategic partnership with France in the 1950s, learning in foreign policy, and the role of leaders' personalities in foreign policy change have been published in peer-reviewed scholarly journals. His op-eds have appeared in both American and Israeli newspapers. And he has a book out. Maybe you can introduce your book as we get to it, but it's basically about the transformation of Shimon Peres from a hawk into a dove, and the phenomenon in general of hawks turning into doves, which I wish we could see some more examples of today. So Guy has been with us on a number of these calls, and he's always incredibly informative and well-informed. So thank you very much for lending your time again. And let me begin by asking you very simply, the election was March 17th, and today is April 22nd. Why is it taking so long to form a new Israeli government?
So a lot of analysts felt, I think the majority of analysts felt that this was going to be very easy, and they underestimated the political difficulties that Netanyahu would face. I think Netanyahu himself probably underestimated the difficulties he would face in forming a coalition, or analysts had said that this could be done within days. They pieced together the coalition, which I think is ultimately the coalition he'll get, and we can talk about that. But these parties, and including some small parties, medium-sized parties, have really taken advantage of the system. And it's kind of a broken system that everyone agrees needs to be changed. Nobody agrees on how to change it. And have made kind of maximal demands. And Netanyahu, in turn, has not caved in, which is why he had to request a 2-week extension. So he has up until May 6th, which would give him the 42 days, and that's the maximum number of days. I would imagine that by then he's going to form a coalition, perhaps even in the next couple of days.
And who are going to be the partners in the coalition? Do remind us of the format of the new government, because we keep hearing rumors that perhaps he will, at the last minute, pivot to ask the Zionist Union, Isaac Herzog, leader of the Labour Party, in the National Unity Government. Is that completely, utterly dead? Or is it still on the cards?
It's not completely, utterly dead. It's a card that he's able to use in his negotiations, or that the Likud party is able to use in its negotiations with smaller parties. Basically saying, look, if you keep making your ridiculous demands, we're not going to go with you, our natural partner. We'll go to the Zionist Union. We'll go to Yesh Atid, perhaps. And the reason that's most likely not going to happen isn't necessarily because Netanyahu doesn't want it. I think at this point, Netanyahu kind of realizes that he might have erred by not going to the Zionist Union earlier on, by ruling them out when he ran for re-election. He probably realizes that Israel is only becoming more isolated, that there's widespread criticism that he and his new government may not be able to handle without a fig leaf. But for Herzog, who personally might be inclined to join a Netanyahu-led government, if for no other reason, just so he can be in power, he understands that that would cost him dearly among many of his supporters, and that could split the Zionist Union. It would be what I've termed an intifada within the Zionist Union. And so I think he's very cautious, very careful about that, which is why it would be a last resort for Netanyahu. Netanyahu would have to make him a very big offer that I don't think would be, that many of his own supporters would be comfortable with, something like a rotation agreement. So the most likely scenario at this point is what we've said all along, which is a narrower right-wing and religious government.
Now, so far, most of the negotiations, as far as one can see, have been with Kulanu, which is the new party, so-called center-right party headed by Moshe Kahlon, Are those negotiations concluded? Have they reached a deal?
So there have been reports that they have come close to reaching a deal, but they haven't signed officially, formally a deal yet, which is why they were able to deny the fact that negotiations have led to a deal. But for all intents and purposes, it seems that they're on board.
And then you have the ultra-Orthodox parties. You have Shas, the Sephardic ultra-Orthodox party, and I believe two Ashkenazi, the United Torah, Judaism, the more Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox parties. Are there deals with them?
Apparently, and this is all, this is not official. This is all based on reports that I've read, and I'm sure you've seen some of these reports too. Yeah, the Shas only got 7 seats in these last elections, so they really shrunk. United Torah Judaism only got 6 seats. So what we're seeing now is possible deals with them, where he's offered them several ministries, to the chagrin of Naftali Bennett of the Bayit Yehudi, the Jewish Home Party, who really wanted to keep the religious affairs portfolio in his hands. And one of the really interesting things about these coalition negotiations is it's the first time I can recall that coalition negotiations are taking place not just privately and in secret, but publicly using social media. Naftali Bennett tweeted the other day that, in English, that if he is going to lose the religious affairs portfolio to Shas, he will quit the coalition talks. And Likud, of course, responded in kind, saying that they're not going to be threatened by anybody on Twitter.
So it's interesting that these two parties, more on the right, the Jewish Home, Yisrael Beitenu, and Avigdor Lieberman's party seem to be the ones that are feeling the squeeze the most. Is that more or less correct? Are they going to?
Yeah, there's also no small amount of personal animosity between Netanyahu and some of these people who used to work for him, under him. And that includes Naftali Bennett, that includes Yisrael Beitenu's Avigdor Lieberman, and it includes Moshe Kahlon. And so there is quite a bit of hostility, bad blood, between Netanyahu and each of these leaders. And to some extent, I think that the Bayit Yehudi party, the Jewish Home Party, felt left out, felt that they were exploited by Netanyahu, who at the last minute was able to steal some of their supporters, a lot of their supporters, and that's how Likud got 30 seats. It came at the expense of the Jewish Home Party. And there were also reports in the Israeli press that prior to the elections, Netanyahu had pretty much promised and assured Naftali Bennett that his party would, that he would get either the defense portfolio or the foreign ministry, which obviously looks really out of the question now. I mean, Bennett's party only ended up with 8 seats, but again, they're blaming that on Netanyahu for last-minute electioneering.
Our guest is Dr. Guy Ziv of American University, and if you have any questions, shoot them to info@jstreet.org, or you can tweet them to @jstreet.org, and the dot is a DOT org. So we'll talk a little bit about what this new government is going to do, but before we get to that, let's talk about the top ministries, who's going to get what. So our understanding is that the finance ministry is going to go to Kahlon, and that Moshe Ya'alon remains as defense minister. Who is going to get the foreign ministry? Is that Lieberman?
Most likely Lieberman. Yeah, I can't imagine Lieberman agreeing to take a demotion. So I think that that's going to be a basic demand of his, and that's probably something that Netanyahu is going to be prepared to meet.
And the housing ministry is an important ministry because that controls a lot of the settlement activities.
Yeah.
That was held by Gurion of the Jewish Home.
That's right.
Are they going to keep hold of that?
It's not clear. It's not clear. If part of the problem is that, there are only so many ministries, and there's some pressure by those who are more reform-minded to limit the number of cabinet portfolios, which would make it very difficult for Netanyahu to please everyone. So they might need to have some creative solutions, such as deputy ministries. Perhaps Naftali Bennett can get more of those. perhaps some sort of rotation in the religious affairs portfolio. That's one option that I've read about. So it's really not entirely clear who's going to get some of these other portfolios, like the housing ministry. And on top of all these demands by these various coalition partners or would-be coalition partners, the Likud rank and file isn't very happy that, here they've worked very hard to get Netanyahu reelected. Likud got a very impressive 30 seats, yet so many of these senior portfolios are going to be given to other parties. And so there's a lot of pressure within the Likud rank and file on Netanyahu to keep some of these portfolios for Likud.
So would it be correct to say, if this is the government that emerges, that this will be the most right-wing government in Israel's history?
Perhaps, although there could be some surprises. So, for example, we don't quite know exactly where Moshe Kahlon is headed politically in terms of security and peace issues. He's been relatively quiet in that. We know that historically he was, right with Netanyahu as kind of a typical Likud opponent of Land for Peace deal. And but since he broke away from Likud and formed his own party, he sounded much more moderate. And of course, some of the people that he's picked on his slate, most notably the former ambassador, Michael Oren, have really come out as much more moderate, perhaps center-right, even center. So it's possible that he will, even though he's focused primarily on the economic realm, that he could go in a more dovish direction and kind of restrain Netanyahu a little bit, or those who are to the right of Netanyahu even. And the same thing goes for Shas and UTJ. They're not left or left of center by any stretch of the imagination, but they're also not committed to Greater Israel. They're not firmly opposed to a two-state solution. Deri has a history of being much more moderate than many of his own voters. So I think that there could be some surprises. But yes, on paper, this could be one of the most right-wing governments. I think the Shamir government of 90 to 92 was also very, very hawkish as well. So this could perhaps rival that government.
And that was the government that got itself entangled in a huge row with the U.S. administration of George Bush, the 41st president, George Bush.
And Rabin was able to defeat them in 92.
Right. So let's say that this government is unveiled sometime early next week or whenever it's unveiled. What is going to be the international response, and particularly the U.S. response and the European response to the government when it finally reveals itself?
I would imagine that the international response will be, let's see what Netanyahu's government plans to do. Will it issue provocations such as new housing tenders? Are they going to embark on a massive expansion? Or perhaps are they going to surprise and initiate something with the Palestinians, perhaps to counter and deflect from the criticism that they've gotten? And what was kind of lost in the media in the last few weeks was that Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, was interviewed and said that he would be willing to go back to the negotiating table. And if that's the case, then the ball is in the Netanyahu government's court.
And what do you think they'll do? There's obviously going to be a pent-up demand for settlement activity. As you say, the Likud rank and file expects this government to adopt very right-wing policies, and the Likud rank and file are to the right of Netanyahu for the most part. What do you think they're going to do?
Well, I think there's going to be intra-government negotiations before there are international negotiations or intergovernmental negotiations. So I think we're going to see some very difficult talks following the formation of the government amongst the parties and the new ministers on the direction that the government will take. And I would imagine that Netanyahu is going to try to be much more cautious and much more, perhaps even moderate than, because he's not running right now. The elections are over, and so he's no longer in election mode, and he's putting on his, prime minister hat on, and as a leader of a country that's really embattled right now. And so I think that he's going to initiate something, not exactly Netanyahu's character, but we'll see. It's really too early to tell.
And in the last government, every time a U.S. official came to Jerusalem, the housing minister, who was from the Rightwing, did announce something almost without Netanyahu's knowledge or approval. So how much control does the prime minister actually have over that kind of thing?
Well, in theory, he has complete control over it. But what we saw in the past government, what we've seen in previous governments, is that Netanyahu does not quite have total control over what other ministers, for their own political reasons, are doing. And perhaps he learned a lesson from that infamous visit of Vice President Biden, where new housing tenders were announced on during his visit. But I think that we're going to continue to see some power struggles there between the various ministers representing the more hawkish factions and Netanyahu, and perhaps some more moderate factions as well.
Now let's turn a little bit to the domestic side, because a lot of the fears, I think, in the progressive community have been that this government will undertake steps to, in some way, jeopardize or diminish or narrow Israel's democracy. And the focus has been, I think, on two things. One is a reordering of the Supreme Court, and the other and the other one is a revival of this idea of adding a nationality act to the basic law of Israel, the constitutional law of Israel. And maybe you could explain those two issues and let us know if you think those will move forward and what the response might be.
Well, there were a series of bills that were proposed, and you just mentioned a couple of them in the previous Knesset. And, to some extent, they were done, again, for purely political and partisan reasons within the Israeli political dynamics. But I think that Netanyahu understands that some of these bills are not just dangerous for democracy, they're dangerous. They represent a real danger to Israel's standing in the international community. Israel is becoming increasingly isolated. I think Netanyahu is aware of it. I think he's concerned about it. And part of the problem has been, in the past, that there hasn't been much of an opposition. And this, I think, when you're asking me about domestic politics, it's not just the government we need to look at, it's the opposition. Is there going to be a unified opposition? So far, I would say they've disappointed. We haven't really heard much from Herzog, the opposition leader, aside from denying as of late that he won't join the government. But on Iran, on the nuclear framework with Iran, he was lockstep with Netanyahu. In fact, in interviews, he and Livni, sounded a more aggressive note, talking about Israeli military action than anything we've heard from Netanyahu or even Bennett. On the peace process, they've been virtually silent, and they haven't said much about these bills that undermine democracy as well. So I think it'll be a real test of leadership whether they are going to behave differently now that they have an opportunity to unite as an opposition.
One of the interesting developments in the last few days has been a decision by, I think, 16 of the members of the EU to put labeling on goods that are produced in the settlements. And this has been interpreted, I think Lieberman said it was the equivalent of the yellow star in the Warsaw Ghetto, or some wild language like that. But it's been interpreted as the first step in a series that might lead us down the road toward boycotts, divestment. And how important was that step? And what do you expect to see coming out of the EU as we go forward?
I don't think any of these steps on their own are really significant. It's the momentum that I think is dangerous for Israel. The growing BDS movement on college campuses around the country, the growing calls for boycotts around the world and in Europe, the European parliaments basically siding with unilateral steps by the Palestinians to take their case to international legal bodies and to the UN. That's where I think the danger lies, the momentum and the cumulative effect of these bills, of the rhetoric, and of course many of these are very hostile in terms of their intention. And lastly, there's also been a partisan divide here in this country that we've never seen before. In the past, Democrats and Republicans were united behind Israel. Today, polling shows that more and more Democrats are uncomfortable with the direction of the Netanyahu government, while Republicans tend to see themselves as kind of more in tune with Israeli government. And so this is also potentially dangerous because the bedrock, the foundations of U.S. support for Israel has always been bipartisan since Harry Truman's recognition of Israel in 1948.
Now, of course, the Israelis are buckling down for a huge fight if there should be a final agreement with Iran over the nuclear issue. What do you think Netanyahu could possibly do to block or sabotage that agreement if it should emerge?
I'm not sure there's all that much he can do at this point. I think he said what he could possibly say. I don't think there's that much new he can say. Clandestinely, I think he's going to be taking actions to the best that he can, just as Israel has in the past. But in terms of really shaping and affecting the final agreement, that's something that I think Netanyahu lost when he undermined openly President Obama and his efforts, when he refused to cooperate with Obama and chose the path of confrontation rather than cooperation. And so I think right now he's being left out of the process. There's very little that he can do. And the Israeli security community, the kind of the ex-generals and former Mossad and Shin Bet chiefs have been much more nuanced about the framework and have raised some important questions about what the final deal will look like. And hopefully the administration and the Europeans will take notice of what they say, which is less about rhetoric and more about concrete, tangible ways to tighten up the legislation and make sure that it's going to be a good agreement.
Now, during the election campaign, toward the end of the campaign, Netanyahu said there would not be a Palestinian state on his watch. And this was taken as a repudiation of his Bar-Ilan speech back in 2009, in which he spoke in favor of a two-state solution. As soon as he was elected, he did try to backpedal and say that he just meant that the conditions on the ground right now were not conducive to a Palestinian state being established. How much damage do you think he did to himself and to Israel with that statement? Has his backpedaling been credible? Is it being believed? Does he need to make another Bar-Ilan speech? What can he do in this situation that he's created for himself?
Well, he did exactly what he wanted to do, which was to get reelected. I think that was his goal. And I don't think the Bar-Ilan speech was very sincere from day one. I'm not one of those who ever believed him. I don't think he supported, and I write about that in my book, incidentally, I don't think he was ever fully on board with a two-state solution, and his subsequent actions and rhetoric indicate otherwise. So I was not very surprised by either his statements on the eve of the elections or walking back those statements a couple days later. Netanyahu hasn't really done anything to indicate that he really believes in a two-state solution, nor is he a bold decision maker. So even if in theory he understands that without a two-state solution, Israel is doomed to a binational state, he's a risk-averse leader. He's not somebody who's going to take bold measures that would perhaps create a split in the right-wing community and therefore lead to his government's downfall or his own personal downfall. I don't see that happening.
When the election...
Sorry, he's interested in managing conflict.
Yeah.
That's really his goal here. There's no vision that he's offering. And incidentally, there's not much of a vision that the opposition is offering either. But in his case, it's clearly to manage the conflict.
Right. So do you see some kind of climax coming in the September session of the UN General Assembly? Some move to recognize Palestine again as a full member of the United Nations, or alternatively, somebody putting on the table a resolution that demands a resumption of the peace talks or lays out parameters for a peace agreement, or condemns the settlements, or all of the above?
Well, I'm concerned about two things in the immediate term. One is resolutions, unilateral resolutions that are going to be put. I think it's inevitable that there are going to be resolutions that Israel's very uncomfortable with. And the question is, will the United States continue to veto them? And I'm not, in the past, the answer was automatically, of course. And now I'm not so sure. It's quite possible the United States will abstain or not veto these resolutions. And the second thing I'm concerned with is possible intifada. We don't really know what's going to happen in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. The tensions are always high, and sometimes are a little higher, sometimes are a little lower. But there could be one event that triggers an intifada, and then it's out of everybody's control.
And this is the time of the year when tensions are traditionally at the highest, because Israel celebrates its Independence Day on the Hebrew date, the declaration. But then we get to May 28th, I think, which is the secular date, and the Palestinians call that Nakba Day. And then after that, there's the reunification of Jerusalem, which the Israelis celebrate, Jerusalem Day, and the Palestinians do not celebrate. So I guess May through June is usually peak tension time in the area.
Not just that, but you also have a very dangerous religious element in Jerusalem. And we saw just last week that Palestinian citizens of Israel who were praying on Al-Aqsa had brought a whole contingent of people who were blocking Israelis from going there, Israeli Jews from worshiping there. And then, of course, you have right-wing, extreme, religious Israeli Jews that insist on changing the status quo, that want to pray on the Temple Mount. And so we have this religious element, this religious infusion, which can really, all it takes is a vigilante. All it takes is one person on his or her own, and that can really shake things up in a very bad way.
Once this election was over, it was said, and even at our conference by members of the Labour Party who came to the conference and from other opposition parties, that this was a government that was likely to last quite a long time because there was a kind of ideological coherence to it. It wasn't such an uncomfortable fit as, let's say, the last government where you had Yesh Atid from the middle and Hatzanuah, Tzipi Livni in together with the very right-wing Jewish Home, and but this time all the parties are more or less to the right, or they're concerned with religious affairs. The kind of analysis that you've offered here contradicts that in some way.
Mm-hmm.
So do you think that this government will indeed be coherent and able to go the length of its term? Or do you think that all Israeli governments, because of the system that they live in, are inherently unstable?
The latter. I mean, I don't think it's just about coherence. Is this government going to be more ideologically coherent, assuming that Netanyahu establishes a right-wing religious government? Sure. But this is not just about ideology. This is about portfolios. It's about budgets. And we've seen governments, collapse or on the verge of collapse because of petty issues. You have, for example, issues that have nothing to do with ideology, issues like the move to draft ultra-Orthodox men into the army to call for national service. The Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox parties, are insisting on reversing and rolling back this legislation. If that happens, Lieberman's going to be out. So I think that there are many, many reasons that this government will not necessarily last its full term. I'd be surprised if it does.
It's coming up on a year since a horrible war that happened last summer in Gaza. And there was a lot of talk about reconstruction in Gaza, none of which happened. I believe there was a delegation that went from the West Bank, a Fatah delegation, and then turned around and went back. So do you see the potential for another summer military confrontation between Hamas and Israel, or are they still rebuilding their arsenal?
Very unclear. I think they're always rebuilding their arsenal. And in the last 24, 48 hours, there have been reports about problems between Fatah and Hamas. So I would not be surprised if their unity agreement collapses right around the time Netanyahu is forming his own government. So I don't know. I mean, there's always a possibility of more confrontation. I don't think Netanyahu wants one. I don't think Hamas necessarily wants one, but they're rebuilding. We know that they've been rebuilding tunnels from the moment the Gaza war ended. So it's more a question of time. It's a question of when, not if.
We're talking to Dr. Guy Ziv from American University. And as we speak, you probably hear in the background an ambulance going past outside the window, which I will let go past before we continue. I'd like to talk a little bit to conclude our discussion with what you see happening in the US-Israel relationship, which is obviously really quite bad right now. And it's not just a question of the antipathy between President Obama and Netanyahu, Obviously, there are the clashes over Iran, which will continue. And then there's this business of Netanyahu's repudiation of the two-state solution. So where do you expect that relationship to go as we move forward?
Just when things couldn't get worse, I think the next few months are going to be very tough between the Iran deal, the pending Iran deal, and the formation of the right-wing Netanyahu government and whatever first moves that it decides to make, and the overall partisanship that's been characterizing our relationship of late with Israel. I think that that things are going to be worse for a while. They're going to be tough. At the same time, you have the presidential elections coming up, and so I think that in about half a year from now and a year from now, all attention within the next 6 to 9 months will begin to focus on the presidential campaign. And here, I think there might be some interesting dynamics, because Netanyahu is not necessarily going to want to test Hillary's patience, even though she's probably going to be less hostile, less resistant to Netanyahu than the Obama people have been. I still think he's going to be very careful about what he does. And of course, you're going to have Republicans that are going to be locked in step with Netanyahu. So it'll be interesting whether or not, to what extent, Israel is going to be inserted into the presidential campaign. To some extent, already has been. And
in 2012 and before that, both parties had the two-state solution as part of their party platforms that were adopted at the party conventions. Do you think the Republicans will continue to be in favor of a two-state solution? Because some of the candidates out there don't sound like they're very much in favor of a two-state solution, from what I've seen.
Right. I think that I don't know if anybody actually reads these platforms, but regardless,
this is one thing that they do read. There was a big flap about Jerusalem, if you recall, in the Democratic platform, I believe, in 2012. So I think this is the one clause that they maybe do read.
We'll see. Some of the Republicans, I think, that you're referring to are that are more extreme and on Israel too, also more extreme domestically. I'm not sure they're the ones that are actually going to make it in the primary. I think that if we're looking at the kind of the major candidates, like Bush, for example, I have a hard time believing they're going to rescind the two-state solution. But even if they're on record supporting it, I'm not sure that really matters in the end, because they're not going to be pushing for it aggressively as say other candidates might be.
Right. And Hillary has a checkered background in this. She kind of stayed away from it when she was Secretary of State as much as possible.
And I think she's going to be extraordinarily cautious now as well, now that she's running. I mean, she's a good politician, and she tends to be kind of calculated when it comes to these things. So I don't expect her to push for anything before she gets elected.
Now, Netanyahu, at some point in the next term, is probably going to pass Ben Gurion as the longest-serving prime minister in Israel's history.
If he fulfills
his term. And but there is this phenomenon that you see in different countries where very dominant leaders eventually lose their magic, and it certainly happened to Margaret Thatcher in Britain, to give one example. It doesn't tend to happen so much here because the president is term limited to 8 years, but it does happen. Do you think that he's reaching his sell-by date at some point? He seems to be very, very good at staying afloat in the Israeli political waters, although he's great tactically. I would argue that strategically he's a disaster. He has no vision, and he won't be remembered for very much apart from the longevity of his service.
Sure.
But are Israelis going to at some point fall out of love with him? Is there going to be a realistic alternative emerging to him?
Well, I don't believe that the Israelis were ever in love with Netanyahu. I mean, if you look at public opinion polls, approval ratings, his approval ratings have rarely surpassed 40%. Maybe during the Gaza war, I think they were a little bit above 50% for a couple weeks. So he's never been that popular or well-liked. I think he's a good politician. He's a great tactician. I would agree with you. There is no vision or overall strategy other than to keep afloat. And I think the problem has been on the left, that there's been no real viable candidate who offers him or herself as an alternative. And we've seen how many leaders has Labor gone through in the last 15 years? Something like 7 to 9 different leaders. So I think that tells you that people aren't really happy or impressed with any of the other candidates. And so what will be interesting is, A, whether Herzog will emerge as that potential replacement. I mean, he did better than Labor had done in previous elections. But so far, as I said earlier, we're not seeing much of an opposition leader. And if not, will somebody else, somebody from the outside, perhaps an ex-security official, step in and present himself as a viable alternative? That's something that remains to be seen too in the coming years.
So it's an interesting time, and we'll see what we see. We'll have another briefing with an expert once we have a government and we can see who got which portfolio and what they're likely to do. I want to thank Guy for coming and so generously sharing his time. And this has been the latest of just a whole series of talks. So we really, really appreciate your expertise and your friendship. And Guy was also at the J Street conference a couple of weeks ago. And I want to thank everyone who tuned in. I hope it's been interesting and informative. And with that, farewell, shalom, and happy Independence Day from Washington.